Hello?
Hey, Rich, it's Larson. You got a minute?
Sure, Larson, what's up?
Hello, it's Larson Hicks with Pastor Rich Lusk again. You're listening to the Got a Minute podcast. Rich, good to have you again here, sir.
Great to be with you, Larson, as always.
I'm in my office again. I brought a light because I noticed last time like the sunset and the lighting in my office changed dramatically from the beginning to the end. So got a little bit of a light pointing in my face. So maybe that'll be better. Hey, so we don't have as per usual, we're kind of shooting from the hip here, but we ended up having about a 40-minute conversation prior to hitting the record button about a bunch of things.
We should have hit record 40 minutes ago.
I know. This is what we should do but it's all right. It's all right.
We've already had a good conversation. Now we have to see if we can recreate it for our
now we have to try to recreate, which is
audience.
It's not going to be nearly as good probably, but that's all right. Now we were talking about we were kind of catching up on work and life and some different things and kind of got into some conversations about leadership and then that kind of led into this news about this pastor up in this PCA pastor up in Nashville, and I'm not fully up to speed on the whole situation, but it sounds like you've heard a little bit. You've read a little bit about it. What's going on?
Yeah, I haven't really read that much about it. I know nothing about the situation. But anytime a pastor, I've spent a lot of years in the PCA, so I'm pretty familiar with that territory in the Series C now. But anytime a pastor of a large church, there's some kind of coming apart, right. And especially one that grabs headlines like this did, even in secular newspapers. I mean, that's something to pay attention to. So I don't have any inside information. I don't know really what happened there, but one thing we've talked about a lot on this podcast is leadership. There are a couple things that I thought about. It sounds like Scott Sauls is being, I don't know if you could say pressure to resign or he just chose to resign or what, but he has confessed to various things, being a manipulative leader, or maybe, I don't remember if the word abusive was used. I don't remember exactly what the language was, but basically that, and the thing about that, that is so odd or interesting is that Scott Sauls is one of those guys who's been really on the forefront of the sort of third wayism in the PCA, trying to find a peaceful resolution between sort of the extremes of right and left. He's been right on the forefront of sort of the winsomeness campaign, like, let's just be winsome, that kind of thing. So it was odd to me and intriguing and certainly counterintuitive in certain ways that he would be targeted as this manipulative and tyrannical leader who, like he says, he manipulated facts and that kind of thing to try to ramrod decisions through and that kind of thing. And it made me wonder, all of that might be true. And I don't know anything about his situation. So anything I say from this point forward, I mean, it may or may not apply to him. I have no idea. But it's still interesting to me as I think about kind of the larger forces at play in something like this. You have a situation now where, a lot of churches have become, even fairly conservative churches, like say in the PCA or other, SBC, other fairly conservative denominations that have become pretty woke, that have embraced a great deal of the woke agenda. And I think the problem with that, what I have seen is wokeness is an acid that will ultimately eat through everything because you can never be woke enough. And I think any pastor who adopts a wokeness, let's just say a wokeness approach to things, is really undermining his own ministry and his own ability to lead. I mean, think about this. Wokeness is kind of an offshoot of Marxism. Sometimes it's associated with cultural Marxism.
Sure, yeah.
Critical theory is another label that gets used. But basically the idea is that all relationships have an oppressor and an oppressee. Well, obviously, then if you're the pastor of a congregation, you're automatically going to be the oppressor. So if you adopt that mindset, that mentality, then any decision you make, any direction you try to take the church, anything you do that is assertive as a leader, it can be interpreted as oppressive. You're oppressing other people. You're not being sensitive to other people's feelings. This is the whole thing, too, we've seen in recent debates. And we actually did an episode on this way back talking about Edwin Friedman and his work. It's empathy run amok. It's empathy without a moral compass. And so, if you train people in empathy kind of becomes the ultimate virtue. Well,
Hmm.
anytime a leader makes a decision, there are going to be some people who are on the short end of that. There are going to be some
Yeah.
people who have their feelings hurt. They didn't get their way.
Right.
And if empathy is the controlling thing, then you basically have undercut your ability to make any kind of decision as a leader. Any decision that you make,
Hmm.
um, again, because every decision is going to in some way create winners and losers. Are going to create people who
Right.
got what they wanted and people who didn't. If you've got this untethered empathy on the loose,
Right.
say in your congregation or any community, then it becomes very easy to basically view the leader as oppressive. So to me, I'm not saying that Scott Sauls wasn't an oppressive leader. I mean, I really have no idea. But to me, it's also entirely possible that in that environment, he created a situation where any form of leadership would be considered abusive or
Hmm.
oppressive,
Hmm.
because that's the spirit of the age now. In this hyper egalitarian, critical Marxist, woke environment we're in, any kind of leadership is going to be considered oppressive by certain people. And I wonder if he brought some of this on himself with that. Again, just speculation on my part, but I can certainly see that happening. Again, I think any pastor, you could say any leader, but any pastor who adopts wokeness and
Yeah.
who kind of goes in that direction, I think it's setting himself up,
100%.
setting himself
100%.
up
I
for
mean,
failure.
it's I mentioned when we were talking earlier that I just started listening to the Joe Rigney 6-part kind of series on Canon Plus's app about leadership, and it's been really good. And you said he's channeling Friedman, and definitely, I mean, it's clear that that's a big theme. He's coming to it he was coming at it. I appreciate the way he's like coming to Friedman via Shakespeare and scripture. It's pretty good. But yeah, the the one of the things that he talks about is just this idea of degree of separation, of differentiation between leaders and the folks that are leading, the people that are leading. And it's like, I mean, we've talked about it, but it's like, how does the general of the army make any decision if he's overly empathetic to the soldiers? I mean, you want a general who has the experience, has sat in those been in those boots before, knows what he's asking people to do. But ultimately, and this is the reality of leadership is, and you and I've talked about it a lot. It's just worth repeating. It's worth repeating because I think people, church members need to remember this. Yuri Brito was out here recently to ordain Brian McLean, and he gave this charge to the congregation that you need to have a ministry of encouragement and support, and submission to this pastor. It's he needs to love being a pastor here because of how grateful and how much respect and honor you show to him. And that's not something you get to say in anywhere today. I mean, where else, what other organization are you allowed to say something like that? That the leader, you need to show love and gratitude and honor to your leaders. That's a really important thing. Like, is anybody saying that to anyone anywhere? It's all, you're right. I mean, wokeness is 100% 180, from that. It's leaders tripping over themselves to apologize for their, um, for everything, and just this over. I'm reading, Rich, as we were as you're talking, I just Googled this, and the two things right out of the gates, the two quotes after an investigation. The investigation revealed, quote, a pattern of relational, emotional, and spiritual neglect, which I'm like, take those one at a time.
And what Bible verse?
Yeah,
You know,
what are we talking
what are
about?
we even talking about here? And the definition of sin is so nebulous. It's almost like, and again, this goes back to things that Friedman addresses. It's like there's no sin in the Bible that is identified as hurting people's feelings. Jesus was sinless, but he hurt people's feelings all the time.
100%.
The Apostle
100%.
Paul, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, wrote things that no doubt hurt people's feelings.
Yeah.
So it's just it's Yeah, it's when I read the article and Saul's, you got the quote from Saul's where he's confessing to me. It almost sounded like a struggle session kind of thing. We have successfully extracted a confession from you. Uh, I'm not saying, again, that is, I don't know the facts, but that's
Yeah,
just, it
sure.
kind of has that feel. And certainly, if that's not his case, it's certainly others. I mean, imagine the sales pitch, for a church that's trying to fill their pulpit, trying to call a pastor that has adopted some version of wokeness or neo-Marx thought. So they say to a pastoral candidate, we are a bunch of wokesters, we are a bunch of neo-Marxists. We believe that every relationship is characterized by an oppressor oppressee dynamic. Do you
Yeah.
want to come be our next pastor? So that the very moment you try to exert any leadership over us, we
Right.
can accuse you of being a tyrant and being abusive. He's
Yeah,
going to
no
step into that.
thanks.
you
No
know
thanks. I mean, this is I'm sure one of the contributing factors to low, marriage rates these days is that's the dynamic that pervades our culture, is that, if you're a husband, you're already, I mean, you're in the doghouse from the day one because you are a husband. You're a man, which means you have power over a woman, and you're bigger physically, so that's also more power. It's like you already have two strikes against you. Three, you're male, so that's another strike against you. It's like, you're it's who wants to sign up for that? I mean, who wants to be in that kind of relationship? So it makes sense that a lot of guys are just kind of going, look, I'm just going to do my own thing.
A lot of guys are going to bail for sure, and that's what we see happening. It's one more way our culture is being degraded. I'll say one other thing about this, and we move on to another topic. You
Yeah.
mentioned the Joe Rigney series,
Yeah.
and you're further along in it than I am. I just started watching it, so I'm not that far into it, but I really do like everything I've heard him say.
Yeah.
And just for any listeners who may be wondering who we're talking about with Joe Rigney and Edwin Friedman. Friedman is somebody we have discussed several times before, and Friedman was not a Christian. He's since passed away. But he wrote a book. I don't know. It's probably been 20 years now, maybe more. I don't know. I don't remember exactly when it came out. I probably first read it like 15 years
Yeah.
ago or something. But he's got a book called Failure of Nerve on leadership. And the book is an excellent assessment of what it means to be a leader in the modern world and the kind
Yeah.
of things that you're up against as a leader. So one of the things he talks about is that leaders cannot be overly empathetic. Leaders do have to care about the people they're leading, but
Yeah.
empathy can cripple and even paralyze a leader into inaction because, again, you can never make a decision that's going to make everybody happy. So
Yeah.
if by empathy you mean you have to feel what everybody's going to feel, and unless everybody's going to be pleased with the decision, you can't make one. Well, then no decision's ever going to be made, and
Yeah.
the whole institution you're supposed to lead is going to stagnate. He also talks about being a differentiated leader, which means as a leader, you're able to be connected to those you're leading while you also differentiate yourself from them.
Yeah.
One thing that means, for example, is that you have a well-defined circle of responsibilities. I think a lot of leaders tend to have this very sort of nebulous, poorly defined sense of what their responsibilities are, and their responsibilities sort of they end up absorbing almost everything into themselves and feeling responsible for absolutely everything. But you're really
Yeah.
not, and you need to
Yeah.
have clear boundaries in terms of what you're responsible for and what you're not. Because again, if you don't have a clearly established boundary there in terms of what you're responsible for, it's going to be impossible. Like if a leader feels like he's responsible for every single person in his institution to be happy all the time,
Yeah.
well, that's just impossible. Like you're gonna burn out very very rapidly. But if you
Right.
understand that's not your responsibility, that your responsibilities are much more tightly defined than that, then you can be a leader, you can move forward, and you can deal with the fact that not everybody's going to be happy with you all the time
Right.
because your
Yeah.
job
I
is
mean,
not making everybody happy all the time.
an accusation that a pastor, and again, I know nothing else other than this little snippet I'm reading. Okay, so I'm not, but I'm just gonna pop off on the fact that if the first accusation I'm reading in this article is an investigation revealed a pattern of relational, emotional, and spiritual neglect. Okay, I'm gonna set the spiritual one aside because there may be something more to that, but unless you're talking about a wife, who is saying my husband's been stone cold, distant, won't doesn't love me, doesn't talk to me. If you're talking about that in a marriage, then yeah, that would be something that, if that was a pattern in a marriage of a pastor, I'd go, yeah, that might be something that disqualifies a guy or he needs to take a step down and get that sorted out, kind of thing, right? But it's not talking about that. It's talking about his role at the church. Who said that you're, as a pastor, responsible for the relational and emotional attention to the staff or
Well,
like
a pastor's a huge church with a huge staff. So yeah, what does that mean?
what are we talking about? Who does he owe that to? Where in the job description is it relational emotional support? I mean, I get counts. If you're saying that the guy is biting people's heads off and abusive or what, dressing people down and I'm sure there are certainly ways that you can be abusive. There's real abuse, but
There is
like,
real abuse, yeah.
but that's not what this leads with. And I don't even know if the word abuse comes up in the article. And we're talking about neglect. So they're saying there's a sin of omission. He should have been more emotionally encouraging and supportive to people on his staff and relation. Like, what is that? Like, I'm just trying to imagine what we're actually talking about here.
This sounds like a complaint that came from an HR department.
Golly, I hope not, man. I hope that, if an HR department was going to come to me and tell me that we're going to have to discipline an employee because of emotional and relational neglect, I'm going to say, sorry, guys, you're not at the right company. Like, you're
Right.
at the wrong company. I mean, this is I think the thing that it's important to jump up and down on here is that actually the most critical thing in leadership is your willingness to offend people.
It is.
It's your willingness to say things that nobody wants to hear and that people are going to be upset about, personally offended about. And you have to say it anyway. You have to say it anyway because it's the right thing. It's the biblical thing. And that's the heart. I mean, that's the biggest service that I remember the first time I fired an employee. I was literally physically shaking, I'd never done this before. And it's like, this is awful. Like, this is terrible. I've never done this before. I've never wanted to do this before. And, maybe I've thought that it'd be great to be the guy that makes those decisions. But when you're sitting there across the table from a guy who has mouths to feed and you're saying, this is over, I'm firing you, I'm going to stop paying you. That's heavy,
Yeah. Yeah.
and in this case, the guy had been there prior to me coming on and becoming the CEO, and the people that were there knew that he probably needed to be fired, but were scared to do it, because it's terrible. It's no fun, But anyway, that's, if anything, you need to fire a pastor who's unwilling to say hard things and offend people. I mean, it's definitely the greater sin, or an actual sin, because he does have responsibility for.
Yeah, think about it. I mean, is there anybody that could have
prophetic.
accused the Apostle Paul of being abusive?
Yeah, or the
I mean,
prophets.
Paul will excommunicate people by name in a letter. I mean, talk about shaming people. I mean, you think that Alexander and Hymenaeus felt abused by the Apostle Paul, that they had their feelings hurt because he hands them over to Satan, in his letter that's going to be read publicly to the church. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. But I mean, again, you're exactly right. That is the mark of genuine leadership, is being able to do hard things. Now, obviously, there is a ditch on the other side. There is a certain kind of person that is unnecessarily offensive, or
sure,
in terms of the differentiation, maybe he's got that, but he doesn't have the connectedness that Friedman also talks about. I mean, people do need to know that you do hear about them,
100%,
and that you are connected to them.
Yeah. No, and in the Rigney thing, I'm a little further in than you are, but he started to talk about the most important way that a leader does his work, of leading, is through his presence. And it's not just any presence; it's a calm, controlled, confident presence. And as I'm reading through this thing, another thing that stuck out to me is this statement where this is the pastor speaking. He says, "I verbalized insensitive and verbal criticism of others' work," he said in an apology to a congregation this year. So one of the things that reminds me of, this may be a rabbit trail, but part of leadership is also not being transparent with everybody about your feelings and about a lot of things. You are covering a lot of things. You are hiding a lot of things. You are keeping a lot of things out of view, not obviously for nefarious purposes. If you're doing that, that's a different thing. You're not but one of the things that creates, Rigney talks about anxiety storms, these sort of frenzies of emotion that sweep through organizations, churches or businesses or families. A lot of that is you've completely destabilized a leader who is not calm and under control emotionally, and is not oversharing, is if you're doing those things, you are destabilizing the whole organization, where everybody, examples from day-to-day life, like in business. I just had this issue come up this last week where there was a problem with an employee's paycheck, and it was a problem that we just needed to sort out, behind the scenes, figure it out, and then communicate what we had done, but make an executive decision about how we're going to deal with it or cover it or whatever. But instead, somebody just, and I've talked about it. It's one of my employees made a decision to tell the employee, that, your paycheck may be totally wrong, kind of thing, and, learning moment for us. But it was like, hey, that's kind of a failure of leadership. We need to own this, not create anxiety, and solve this problem, and then come to the team with our solution. I think all the time when I'm thinking about this kind of stuff. I've probably mentioned this before, but do you remember Cesar Millan, the dog whisperer?
Mm-hmm.
Have I said this before?
I don't think so.
If you ever watch a Cesar Millan episode, he basically has it all figured out. He's the guy that takes, they get these like crazy neurotic dogs that are biting everybody and freaking out. And I love this. His solution 100% of the time, I mean, it's never different, is he says you have to have calm, assertive energy. And he grabs the dog, puts the dog on a leash, and he starts walking forward. And that's like, it's like magic. And they call him the dog whisperer because you watch this psycho dog and this little Mexican guy, walks up, grabs the leash, and just starts walking. And the dog is like, oh, a leader's in the room. Like,
Yeah.
Somebody I can follow. And all of the anxiety goes. And when the dog starts freaking out, he just touches it, just gives it a little, just asserts a little bit of force and communicates to the dog physically, I'm in control. You're not in control. Stop what you're doing,
Yeah.
And it's like, if every leader in the country, every husband in the country, could just learn the basics of Cesar Millan, calm, assertive energy, move things forward, just move forward,
Yeah, you mentioned. I mean, that ties a lot into what Friedman says about the presence of the leader being a non-anxious presence, being a calming presence. I mean, the way I put it, I've said, in order to be a leader, you always have to be the calmest person in the room.
Yeah,
I think that's true. And because so I think part of why Friedman's book has been so it's called Failure of Nerve. I think it struck a nerve with a lot of people. I think part of the reason for that, especially since 2016, I may have told this story before, but when I did read the book like 10, 12, 15 years ago, and I mean, I liked the book, and there were some things I jotted down some notes, and there were things about it that I would even say were transformative for me then.
Yeah.
But then I kind of forgot about it, quite honestly. It wasn't something that I referred back to often. And then around 2015, 2016, I heard a lot of people starting to talk about Friedman again. And I was like, I read that book,
Yeah.
But I didn't remember, X, Y, or Z that somebody said about it. So I went back and I read it again, and I was like,
Right.
oh my goodness, this book explains everything we're seeing.
Right.
Because
Right.
basically, what it says is when there's a leadership void, like when people don't have a leader they can trust, and nobody really knows who's in charge,
Right.
then what happens is it's like the whole culture, the whole society becomes kind of a powder keg that's ready to burst into flames the moment something sparks it. Because everything is then reactive. There's kind of this reactivity to anything and everything. And I think that's largely where we are. And I will tell you this: I think the biggest thing is not that we don't have a president we can trust. It's
Right.
not that we have such ridiculously bad and evil and incompetent political leadership in so many different layers of government. It's really not that, although that certainly factors into it. I think the biggest issue we have is that the church has failed.
Yeah.
The church is supposed to be the salt and light in any society. The church really is the leader of any society. And when
Mm.
the church has failed, when the church when the church cannot speak with a single voice because she's so divided, when the church
Hmm.
has compromised herself with worldly culture instead of having the courage to stand apart and speak
Right.
God's truth, that's I think you get a lot of reactivity and a lot of anxiety, a lot of
Yeah.
anxious energy, a lot of nervous energy then flowing through the culture because
Yeah.
it's like the reality is Jesus is in charge. Okay. If we know that, if we know Jesus is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, then there's no reason to ever be anxious no matter what, no matter how
Yeah.
bad your president is, no matter,
Right.
how whatever's happening around you. It doesn't matter how much is swirling around you because Jesus is in charge and you can
Yeah.
trust him. And he's that calming, non-anxious presence
Yeah.
ultimately. And he's the
Yeah.
ultimate leader. He's the king.
Yeah.
And so we look to him and trust him. But when that gets lost, and it gets lost because the church does not put Jesus forward,
Yeah.
because the church is compromised in all kinds of ways, and the gospel gets lost or garbled, then you end up with a society that's incredibly full of anxiety.
Yeah.
And that's what we've got because we've lost sight of the reign of Jesus, the
Yeah.
rule of King Jesus over all things. And
Yeah.
without him, it's impossible for us to find that non-anxious presence in the
That's
culture.
right. And the church leaders need to be non-anxious. But as members, we have a prophetic role in the world, and we are a faithful presence of God. We're Christ's body, His presence in the world, and we should have that confidence. And I think a lot about Christ's commandment not to worry.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
to be anxious for nothing. You are not allowed to be anxious about anything. That's a sin. Don't do that. Okay, it's okay to say I fail at this frequently. I struggle with this. But fill in finish the sentence. I struggle with this sin. It's
Yeah.
a sin. I'm not supposed to do it. Jesus told me not to. And easier said than done. We all have those circumstances that pop up and you get that tightness in your throat and chest or whatever, and you feel that anxiety. But it really it's a commandment, and I think that's a discipline you've got to cultivate as a leader. Is I don't allow myself. I talk about one of my employees told me this, that he had read it somewhere. I can't remember where, but he said worrying is like praying that your worst fears would come true.
Yeah.
It's like you're meditating. It's like you're visualizing and imagining what could like how bad it could be. You're sort of. It's like people talk about visualizing, thinking positive thoughts, and kind of in order to kind of help you get motivated to do positive things. It's like the exact opposite of that. Um, And our Father in heaven, our loving Father in heaven said, don't worry. You're not supposed to.
That's
It's
right.
not good for you. It's bad for you. It'll tear your soul apart. Don't do it.
Yeah.
And more than that, to your point, it's also the strategy for successfully leading in the culture. When everyone's losing their minds and the Christians are calm, it's like, there's something there. Who was it? Did you read that thing this week about, or in the last week or two, there's an article that's been circulating about this lady who grew up Muslim and then
Yeah, I
became
didn't
an
get to read
atheist.
that. that. I
Yeah.
want, it's on my list though, so I want to get to that. Maybe we can come back and talk about that.
Yeah. I read, a couple pages of it. It's pretty long. But yeah, yeah, you know, that's a great example.
It looked like one thing she was saying, and I'm drawing a blank on her name, but she was a Muslim who maybe became an atheist, and now
She
she's a,
did. Yeah.
is what it sounded like to me. That no other faith, worldview, religion, philosophy, whatever, provides the tools that we need
Mhm.
for the kind of civilizational warfare that is upon us.
Yeah. Yeah.
And obviously that is the case. Now, the Christian faith is about more than just civilizational warfare. It's about the
Sure.
forgiveness of sins. It's about
Yeah.
eternal life with Jesus. It's about communion with the triune God. But all of that feeds into a particular way of life and ultimately the formation of a culture and discipled nations through the Great Commission and all that. And so it does seem to me that she was really onto something. And I would totally agree with that. And that ties back in with what I was saying. When Jesus when Jesus is not acknowledged by a culture as Lord of Lords and King of Kings, of course that culture is going to be full of reactivity and
Yeah.
anxiety and nervous energy. Jesus is the ultimate calm, assertive
Yeah.
presence.
Yeah.
He's got ultimate, infinite, calm, assertive energy to work all things together for the good of His bride, the
Yeah.
church. And so that is what ultimately relieves our burdens, our
Yeah.
stresses, our worries, our anxieties. And there really is no other way to ultimately
Yeah.
resolve the things
Yeah.
we're worried about. So
Well,
yes.
and I think this principle kind of came home for me when I was working, had a job. It was fairly early in my career, and had a conversation with an impending conversation with a boss that I knew that I had failed at something, and I was probably, maybe I could be fired. I mean, worst case scenario, I'm going to get fired. And I remember just being a ball of anxiety and coming home and talking to my wife about it. And my wife just said something to the effect of, "You know what you did, right?" And I'm kind of going, I don't think my boss understands because I did this and I tried this thing and it didn't work, but I was trying and I thought I was doing the right thing and it didn't work out, and I didn't hit my number or whatever. And she's like, "But you know what you did, right?" I'm like, "Yeah." And she's like, and you, God knows, right? It's like, yeah. It's like, so don't worry about it. God knows your heart. Like, yeah, your boss may not understand. Your boss may disagree. Your boss may fire you. It's
Right.
okay. God knows what you've done, and you've got a clean conscience, and you can admit your failures and move forward. Knowing that God loves you, and it was just like there was that turning point in my life where I was like, yeah, I think of it as, I call it a coram deo swagger. Like we have this sort of, we live before the face of God. We know that we're in God's presence, that He's here with us, and everything we do is before His face. And it's like, if you really know and believe that, you get to walk with a kind of swagger and confidence that nobody else really, really can have.
Yeah, that's really, really good. That's great.
Well,
You want to talk about
Rich,
this with a minute?
yeah, yeah, I got my copy. And I am I don't know, 10 pages in, maybe. I pulled it out and it looks great. I'm so excited about it. Tell us about it. It's the, what's
Yeah,
it called?
so this is my book called Measures of the Mission, just came out from Athanasius Press, and really excited about it. I just for our listeners, if you haven't heard about it, you can get it from Amazon or Athanasius if you're interested in looking at this book. This book is I've called it my everything but the kitchen sink book because it really is kind of about
Yeah.
everything in a way. I actually had just some background on the book. I had a lot of help on this one.
Yeah.
A lot of the books I've done have been, co-authored. They've been joint projects, as I see it. Pretty much everything in life is communal.
Man,
It's always,
someone needs to co-author a book with me. That'd be awesome.
community. In this particular case, a really sharp layman in my church named Kevin Fox had come over from another church, and he really wanted to, be able to explain and articulate to people why he had come and joined our church. And so, I mean, this started happening, probably over 10 years ago. Anytime I said something in a sermon or, I think it was mainly sermons really, that was like, oh yes, okay, that's why I'm here. That's what people need to hear. He
Yeah.
would go jot that down or transcribe it from the audio recording of the sermon. And he had told me he wanted, a book he could put in people's hands that would, that would basically explain what we're about at TPC and
Yeah.
really the Series C. And so after he had done this for several years, he brought me this binder, full of what he put together. And I said, Kevin, I think you have your book. So really, Kevin was originally going to be a co-author because it's really, it's probably in a lot of ways as much his book as it is mine. And certainly he did a lot of the legwork on it. But in the end, he chose not to be a co-author with me. So it's just got my name on the front. But Kevin was very
That's
instrumental
cool.
in it. But, if you look at the book, I mean, basically the first part of the book is really a summation of the Bible as a whole. And we kind of walk through the overarching story that the Bible tells, which is really the kingdom of God story. The original working title for this book was The Gospel of the Kingdom, and that's kind of a bland title, but the reason for that is, in the book we basically say, look, Jesus did not preach the gospel. Jesus preached the gospel of the kingdom, and we need to understand the difference, because if we just preach the gospel, we're missing a key element of Jesus' message. We're being reductive. We're shrinking the gospel.
Right.
That kingdom part matters. So what is the gospel of the kingdom, and how understanding the kingdom makes our understanding of the gospel so much bigger, so much more expansive? That Jesus came not just to save souls and get them into heaven when people die. He actually came to bring in a whole new world. To restore God's fallen creation. Ultimately, of course, that's consummated with the new heavens and new earth at the last day. But even now, the kingdom is already present in the world. That the mustard seed of the kingdom has been planted, and it is growing into the greatest of all trees, and it's going to grow and fill the earth. Every image we have of the kingdom in the Bible is of something that grows. So we really tell the story of the Bible, going through creation, fall, redemption. What does the resurrection mean? What are the consequences of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2? What about Jesus' Olivet discourse and the ending of the old covenant in 70 AD with the destruction of the temple? We look at all of that and basically say, here's the big picture that's, in terms of the story that Scripture is telling. Here's where things are going. You need to latch onto that. We don't use the label post-millennialism, but that's really what we're talking about. Is a view of the kingdom as growing and victorious in history, leading to the final victory at the last day. So that's really the first part of the book. The second part of the book really focuses on the church as central to God's kingdom. If Jesus preached the gospel of the kingdom, that really means he preached a gospel that is connected to the church. It's the gospel of the church, you could say. And so we talk about what the church is, and we talk about the mission of the church and the nature of the church's communal life. We talk about the church's role in discipleship and how discipleship really can't take place outside of the context of the church. And we talk about the liturgy, covenant renewal worship, which is something that's distinctive in many ways about the Series C, but I think it's very much rooted in the church's historic patterns of worship, and especially in the scriptures. And so God's given to us a liturgical pattern. It's important that we uphold it because it's so formative. It shapes us, and worship is central to everything else we do. Worship is really the fountainhead. And if you pollute the river at the fountainhead, then everything downstream is going to be polluted. But if you've got pure living water flowing out, then that's going to bring transformation and renewal to everything. And then the last section of the book is kingdom living. What does it look like to live out the kingdom and to live out the implications of the kingdom in everyday life? And so we talk about work, is a big part of this. So we talk about our daily vocation. We talk about marriage and family life. We've actually got a chapter on singleness as well, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about singleness and even what it means to call singleness a gift. We got a chapter on marriage, a chapter on parenting, cover all those kind of things. And at the end, we've got some appendices that kind of go into some political theology as well for people who are interested in that. Like I said, it's kind of the book about everything. It's kind of my everything but the kitchen sink book. It doesn't go into great depth about any of those things, obviously, because we're covering a lot of ground. My slogan for the book is the whole gospel for the whole of life. That's how we really are summarizing this. The whole gospel coming to bear upon the whole of life. And that's really what it's about.
That's awesome. Well, it's funny because I remember a time in my life where I heard a lot of teaching and preaching on, with the word kingdom, and it's one of those words where, it just kind of can bounce off your head. You just kind of, it's kind of like any buzzword, I guess, like covenant or gospel, even, all these words can sort of just lose their meaning, and just, you kind of pass right by them when you read scripture. But there was a moment, there was a moment where the concept of the kingdom, of the gospel of the kingdom, when you hear scripture say the gospel of the coming of the kingdom,
Yeah.
and there's a moment where that all clicked, and I was like, wait a second, this is it. Like, this is what this whole thing's about, and I think if you grew up in the evangelical church, modern evangelical church, as I did, the gospel, it stops at the gospel. It's not the gospel of the kingdom or the
Right.
coming of the kingdom. It's
Right.
just the gospel. But what is the gospel? You ask someone what the gospel is. The good news of the coming of the king, of Jesus, the king of what? The kingdom, like
Right.
coming of the kingdom.
Right.
So it really is one of those things. And once you see it, you can't really unsee it. And you start to see that. And I do think, your eschatology and that optimism about what the gospel is going to do in the world, beyond private feelings.
Yeah. Yeah.
That when those two things kind of start to line up, and you start to see that we're talking about the gospel changing the world, not just changing everyone's feelings or loves, but it's actually going to change the world. But I think the mistake, and this is where a lot of the criticism about Christian nationalism have come in recently, is the mistake is kind of cage stage post-millennial or cage stage kingdom people. They run all the way to the end and go, oh, so you're saying someday our politics and our laws and our civilizations are going to be Christian? That's great. Let's start doing that. Let's start taking over, and it's like, well, hold on, wait a second. It's how does the kingdom come? And that's where you get back to covenant renewal worship. It's how does the kingdom come? It's not going to come through politics, but will politics be transformed? Absolutely.
Absolutely. Right. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Will our society, will art, will science, will all of that be transformed? 100%. But none of it comes through those things. That's the fruit. That's not the root,
Yeah, so I see two basic issues with American Christians when it comes to the public square. You have those who think the way we're really going to change the world is through politics,
Right.
and so they're basically playing the same game as the secularists.
Right.
It becomes a humanistic kind of thing. It's what we can do in our own strength, and so they think, we just need to get the right guys elected and the right laws passed, and that will manifest the kingdom. Actually, what happens politically is way downstream from what happens culturally and ultimately what happens liturgically. So you're not going to get the political transformation unless you've already had the cultural transformation, which is only going to happen if you have the liturgical transformation. So there's that. So the other problem, so that's one problem I think American Christians have, is thinking we can bring in the kingdom through politics, to put it crassly. No, probably nobody would put it quite that way, but that is the impression you get from some people. The other, the sort of the mirror image of that problem is a privatization. Right. And it's saying, well, we keep our Christian faith separate from politics. The Christian faith is, it's spiritual, it's heavenly, it's eternal. It has nothing to do with these temporal, historical, earthly concerns. And that's also false. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to Jesus. And our mission is to disciple the nations which exist in history, which are very earthly, which have political, they're organized politically. So you cannot privatize the Christian faith. You can't turn it into something that's purely personal, that only impacts people's personal lives. The gospel is all about the lordship of Jesus. And so, of course, it's got to be transformative in the public square. We want to see Jesus acknowledged everywhere. I've been really critical of some of the stuff on the Christian nationalism side, like Stephen Wolfe and some of those guys, and I think there's some problems with that. And I'm not even sure that the label really is super helpful. We could debate that, but the reality is we do want Christian nations. We want Christian everything. We want Christian towns, and we want Christian cities, and we want Christian families, and we want Christian schools, and Christian universities, and Christian hospitals, and ultimately, yes, we want Christian nations, and Christian civilizations, and Christian empires. So there are some people today who are denying that they basically are denying the possibility of a Christian nation. They will say only individuals can be Christian. And I
Right.
think that's just a misunderstanding of what's meant. When we say Christian nation, we don't mean the Christian faith is being imposed on people by force. And we don't
Right.
even mean a nation where every single individual is converted or
Right.
even becomes a Christian in some nominal way. But we do mean a nation that in its official form, in its official
Right.
capacity as a nation, acknowledges Jesus for who he is, his word for what it is, and the church for what she is.
Yeah.
And so public life is organized on those basic principles.
Do you think some of the, it's interesting. This is just occurring to me at this very moment, but this idea, like there's, um, when you try to triangulate how do we get to where we are today? Why do people think the way they think? And you talked about individualism. We've talked about kind of a pessimistic eschatology. All of these things play in, but I think there's so much confusion about what is a culture or what is a nation, what is a civilization that I think I just this week, I think it was a British, I listened to some speech. I don't know if you saw this, some British, you know, leader. Okay. And some lady who, I don't think she's a Christian or anything. But she was basically saying multiculturalism is destroying our nation. And we've got to, if the idea of being British in her example means nothing, then, then we're just saying everything good about our way of life that we love and appreciate it doesn't matter. We don't care about it, and we're happy just to see it go. And she's just saying this doesn't work. This is cultural suicide. You're saying anyone come in and bring whatever you want in, and we're just gonna, like, the idea that you come to a nation and you assimilate, um, is gone. The woke folks have called that oppression. And what it really is, I mean, if you really look at it, it's invasion. It's the opposite. It's a foreign, culture coming in and invading and taking over, and they're keeping their cultural distinctives and pushing it. But
Right.
It's always been historically that if you want to become a citizen, you got to
You have to assimilate in some
adopt
way.
our way of life.
Yeah. So think about what's happening here. Okay. So the West has largely apostatized. So we have turned against our Christian heritage.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the only thing that gave the West coherence was the Christian faith. The only thing that tied all these disparate people groups together was the fact that they had some connection with Jesus and his church. Hilaire Belloc, who is a Roman Catholic scholar, once said, he said, Europe is the faith. And what he meant by that was, like, if you want to see what the Christian faith looks like, what it does in the world, look at Europe, because
after a thousand, couple thousand years,
the leaven of the gospel worked its way into the dough of European. Well, I mean, I can't even say European, just into the culture of all these tribal groups, and knitted them together into a cohesive people. So you had all these different ethnicities, these different tribal groups, who basically all come to share a reasonably common culture, so that we can describe Europe as a thing. So we can say Europe and mean not just geography, but a culture. We can talk about Western civilization, a way of life that all these people share. And the Reformation did not shatter that. The Reformation wanted to continue Christendom, but it wanted to, in a sense, build Christendom on an even sturdier foundation than what was happening, by making sure we're building squarely upon the Word of God. Now, of course, other forces came along and secularized things. And I think ultimately this is largely due to the unfaithfulness of the church, Protestant and Roman Catholic, in the following centuries. So secularism arises, which then is really at war with the Christian faith. And what happens is people in the West now are really undergoing a crisis of identity, and we can't embrace our past because our past is Christian.
Yeah.
Okay. So what do? Multiculturalism is not about a love for other cultures. It's so important to understand that. When people talk about multiculturalism,
hatred of your own culture.
It's hatred of your own culture. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And so you have people who they're filled with self-loathing.
Yeah.
They hate their own nation. They hate their own heritage. I mean, it's so interesting. This transgender shooter in Nashville.
Nashville, yeah.
The parts of her manifesto have come out. There's probably more that will eventually come out, I'm guessing. But
Yep.
but literally, it was filled with self hatred. Okay, she was taught to hate white people and what she calls white privilege and all of that. And so, and she talks about these private school kids and their khaki pants and their crackers and all this kind of thing. But she's that, that's part of who she is too, because
Right.
she's white.
Right.
And so, in attacking these kids at the private school, she's really in a way attacking herself. It's really a form of self hatred as much as anything else.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, you could say the same about transgenderism. Transgenderism is hatred of
100%.
one's own body, hatred of one's own self.
Right.
The dysphoria is really a form of self hate. So that's what we have. Is we have a culture that has no confidence in itself, because all the principles it was built upon, it now despises and rejects because they came out of the Christian faith. And so Britain has no way to say no to Muslims coming in,
Right.
who have no intention of assimilating.
Right.
And really, in a lot of ways, it's the same in America now. We have no way of saying no because we don't have any sense of our own identity. Or we don't say, you can come, but you have to assimilate, because we have nothing to assimilate them to. The reason America worked as a nation of immigrants is because pretty much everybody that came shared a Christian heritage, some form of the Christian faith. And that's what allowed us to assimilate together and form this new nation of America.
Yep.
And so, the fact that you could have been, English or Scottish or French or Polish or Italian, and you could come to America and make a life and find a way to fit in, because there's at least this broad family resemblance that we all have in terms of our worldview. So we might have various differences, and you can even hang on to some of those differences, but you're still going to assimilate because America's got the Christian faith at its core, and you identify with that. But you take the Christian faith away, now it's just a house of cards, and it easily falls over. And that's where we are. Europe's getting there faster because, we've got the Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, that make it a little bit tougher for people to get here who are as contrary in their way of life. Of course, we've got problems on our southern border. That's a little bit of a different issue. But again, it comes back to the same thing. Western man is now filled with self-hatred. He hates his heritage. He hates himself. He doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know who he is.
Yeah. I listened to a little bit of Elon Musk's recent interview with Joe Rogan, and he was asked, why did you buy Twitter? And his answer was, he said Berkeley, I think it's Berkeley, California, wherever they are, Twitter's headquarters, he said, is a far left extremist death cult that hates civilization. They call themselves, there are people there that self-identify as extinctionists. They want the human race to be. So these people hate people on planet Earth.
All those who hate me love death.
Right. So they hate life. They hate humanity. And he said his fear was that this extremist, far left extremist death cult had this global reach through Twitter, and that this stupid mind virus that should sort of be contained to this small geographic area was getting propagated globally through Twitter, because to these guys everything in their mind was extremely right, because everything is extremely right to them. There's nothing that's further left. So they start filtering and muting and shutting down anybody who's saying anything that's anywhere right of them. And you've got billions of people who are checking their Twitter feeds every day and are slowly being, so he was like, I just said, I was just scared about the impact that Twitter was going to have on civilization and wanted to just stop it, That was interesting.
I'm glad he did. I mean, Twitter, or X as it's called now, not perfect, obviously by any means, and it's filled with all kinds of garbage that comes from the right and the left. But I do think it's better.
I don't think I think I read somewhere, I heard him say like he hasn't banned anybody or censored anybody yet. I mean, there's stuff they have to take down because it's illegal, like pornography or whatever.
It'd be great if they had no pornography there, but
right.
Yeah. So you're exactly right. multiculturalism is a form of self-hatred. Radical environmentalism is a form of self-hatred and hatred of humanity. And of course, people hate humanity because they hate God. I mean, you are the carbon source that they want to eliminate. Okay, it's not your car, it's not cows, it's ultimately you that they want to get rid of. And it's important to understand that all these things are suicidal, and they are the outcome, they are the product of rejecting the God who made us and the Savior, his Son, that he sent. That's what it comes down to.
It's. I just thought it was an interesting rabbit trail, maybe valuable, but just, when you're talking about the source, like how have we gotten to where we are, and why is the idea of the kingdom so diminished? Well, I'm thinking one of the things we've been indoctrinated in for quite a while is this multiculturalism, this hatred of our culture, in particular.
Right. Cultures do have the right, nations do have the right to defend themselves in various ways, not just against, say, a military invasion, but against an invasion of immigrants who don't intend to assimilate, who would overthrow their way of life. We're not doing that right now. And again, I think the reason that, say, the Democrats have had no interest in protecting our southern border is because they do hate America. And they do want to remake this country into something radically different than what it's been. And this is because they hate the Christian heritage that stands behind our nation. And so this is a way to eliminate it. But and that's that's why we are concerned about it. It's not that we're anti-immigrant. I'm fine with having lots of immigrants come in. I think our nation can handle lots of immigrants if they come here to work and not just receive welfare benefits. If they come here to assimilate, to a reasonable degree, and not just come and basically continue to do their own thing. So, which is how America's always looked at immigration. That is the historic American position, and I think that's where we ought to be. But
it's the only rational position, ultimately.
And we've obviously been a nation that for most of our history has been very welcoming to immigrants. But with those particular conditions or caveats,
part of our identity.
That's something now that's being, if you say something like what I just said, you'll be accused of racism. Well, it's not racism. It's not racism at all to want to defend your own country any more than it would be racism to want to maintain your own family's identity and heritage and culture. So,
It's only racist when white Christians want to do it.
That's right. Especially white Christian males.
That's right.
We're the ultimate villains in the story.
That's right. Well, hey, Rich, it's been a lot of fun, man. It's been a minute here, as it turns out. We were thinking this would be a short one, but we found a way.
We did to fill not just 1 minute, but about 60. So But Larson, was great talking with you as always.
Yes. Looking forward to the next one, sir.
Sounds good. All right, man. Take care.
All right. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
The God a Minute podcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. If you like this podcast, you might enjoy one of our other podcasts, The Good Life Podcast, featuring Matt Carpenter interviewing experts in their field about how their work contributes to the good life.